Hi everyone, and welcome to the Muscle Fiber Type and Performance and Adaptation to Training lecture. This is a great lecture for many people because it helps provide some language and understanding as to how we develop and change and train our skeletal muscles and that system, which is great fun for those of us with interest in exercise physiology. We're just generally wondering about, exercise and health and fitness in that realm. Okay, so first up, we're going to explore something in this concept called muscle fiber types. So we have a number of different types of muscle fibers, but generally speaking, we have one of two that we'll use in our discussion, primarily type 1 and type 2. Okay. So type 1, as we can see here, is something that we call slow twitch. So the rate at which it fires and recovers is done slow, okay? We also note that it takes a slow or longer period of time to reach its peak force, and that peak force tends to be significantly lower than relative to type 2, right? And here's a diagram kind of, illustrating this as I discussed to give you a visual. So again, this teal line is type 2 or fast twitch, and here we see slow twitch as being a lower peak force and taking longer to reach kind of its maximum force. Yeah, and so, well, as we can imagine from our discussions with our metabolism and bioenergetics and how we generate energy, it makes sense then that if we have this slow twitch muscle fiber, which is slow to generate force, doesn't produce a lot of force, this should sound very familiar to oxidative metabolism for you. And sure enough, we find that these muscle fibers, again, just to put yourself in orientated where in the muscle we're talking about the long strands of muscle fibers or sarcomeres, right, that are attached, joined together. So in these muscle fibers, we'll find that they're oxidative primarily, so we call them slower twitch, less force production, and they're fatigue resistant. So when you hear fatigue resistant, ideally, you're already picturing endurance type events. We'll look at type 2 muscle fibers. So we'll actually note that there's 2A and 2X, and we'll dive into exactly what that entails slightly later, but you can consider both fast twitch. So what does that mean? Well, it's kind of the opposite if you want to think of type 1 muscle fibers. So they generate force rapidly, they generate a larger amount of force, they don't have very good oxidative metabolism capacity, and so therefore they fatigue very easily. So already, hopefully that's ringing a lot of bells for you and making you think about anaerobic metabolism, right? That's this primary source. When we were covering that material, we already stated, okay, short-term high force production, that's type 2 muscle fibers, that's anaerobic activities. Sure enough, we find for short-term activities and sprint type performances or large force production, we're talking about type 2 muscle fibers, okay? So what's helpful here, aside from this graph I find, is looking at a table and just comparing some metrics that differentiate the two between type 1 and type 2 muscle fibers. We don't speak too much about myofibril ATPase activity per se, but all these other components that I box in the red, you'll notice are type 2 muscle fibers or anaerobic or big force producing muscle fibers have in high quantities or produce quickly, whereas the green box here is geared more towards lumping together all the changes or adaptations or preferences that the type 1 muscle cells have or muscle fibers have that are in large supply or produce a lot of. So in brief, because we'll cover this a little bit, some aspects of this in greater detail later. Again, there's more force per cross-sectional area for type 2 muscle fibers. There's a higher amount of intramuscular ATP stores, and we spoke about this when we were talking about anaerobic metabolism. So hopefully you're pairing, again, type 2 muscle fibers with our anaerobic metabolism in your minds. They have a greater amount of phosphocreatine. Again, that's anaerobic metabolism. So the contraction speed is significantly faster. Their relaxation time after contracting is very quick as well. And our glycolytic enzyme activity is also high. That should seem familiar from our anaerobic metabolism discussion. Okay. For the endurance-based or our type 1 muscle fibers, we see that they are high in endurance. So another way of saying that is they are low in fatigability, whereas our type 2 muscle fibers would be high in fatigability. Intramuscular glycogen stores, if you recall, both systems really need glucose readily available in the muscle, so we see that. But if you recall in our discussion then, the main difference with intramuscular glycogen stores for type 2 muscles, sorry for the helicopter. So again, there's no difference between type 1 and type 2 on that metric. But again, type 1 being aerobic, we see that there's a greater amount of triglycerides. So if you recall, that's from fats, and that's how we get our large stores of oxidative metabolism from. Myoglobin is a new concept, but it's essentially a molecule that pulls oxygen from the capillaries to our mitochondria. So it's like the shuttle system for that. So we see more of that within our cells, our muscle cells, in particular type 1 muscle fibers. We have more aerobic enzymes. So what does that mean? Well, that's our Krebs and our ATP enzymes, the ones used in those bioenergetic processes. We have more capillaries at a greater density around type 1 muscle fibers. And last but not least, we have more mitochondrial density. And again, if you think about what you remember from aerobic metabolism, so what houses that part of our bioenergetic systems? The mitochondria. So we're going to have more of those found in our type 1 muscle fibers. Okay. Definitely know these metrics and be able to associate whether type 1 or type 2 has a greater amount of the whatever it is found in that. Okay. So how do we know this? Well, one of the ways that we came across this concept of muscle fiber types is through different imaging and the stain type histology processes. So this is a more modern version, the immunofluorescent staining, and we can see in this cross section of a biopsy of a muscle cell. Essentially, a biopsy is where you take a small hole punch right into the muscle, pull it out, and you get a little transection of the muscle that you can look under a microscope. You'll see this. Classically, muscles used to get, or still do, get treated to different levels of pH. So again, different levels of, say, acidity or base. And we'll see that different muscle fiber types pick up or change color based on that. Okay. So we take a peek here at the second stain system here. You'll note that there's 6 different muscle fiber types listed here, but I want to simplify that a little bit for you. Again, typically we focus on type 1, 2A, and 2X as the predominant types of muscle fiber types, and we'll see here that there's just a little bit of crossover in between these muscle fiber types, or what we'll call hybrid muscle fibers. Now, we'll return to that in our discussion about muscle adaptation. But again, focusing here on type 1, which is, if you recall, our slow twitch, and type 2, which is fast, we see that we have predominantly 3 types. I wanted to, you should be introduced to the idea of fast oxidative glycolytic fiber types, so that's our 2A. And one way you can think of this is we have a little bit of our pure type 1 slow twitch muscle fiber over here on the left with type 1. And then on the far right-hand side, we have our 2X, which is a bit more of a pure anaerobic muscle fiber type, or fast twitch. And then we have 2A, which is a bit of this intermediate. And again, if you remember what glycolytic or glycolysis is, that should make sense to you in the sense that we see a lot of this is utilized to help prep different, will essentially help prep materials to go into the oxidative system, right? If you remember, glycolysis can produce some molecules to be able to do that. One of the newer ways or approaches that staining or different identification of muscle fiber types can occur now is through looking at the heavy myosin chains. One of the ways that we help differentiate muscle fibers now is by looking at the heavy chain or myosin heavy chain. So if you recall back, myosin is the thick filaments in our sarcomeres. And so we have ways that we can identify what sort of proteins are available, and what we find is there's a few different subtypes. And we label them the same that we would our muscle fiber types, but you actually can get more specific than this. So they'll have MHC or myosin heavy chain at 9 or 7, and we can identify and stain for those. But it's just one more way that we can help identify and differentiate. This is typically used in the immunofluorescent format of histology, but yeah, I digress. It's just one more way that we can kind of look and support that there are different subtypes of muscle fibers, okay? So it's, again, just a little bit of a background trying to differentiate what is type 1, what is type 2A, and 2X. Sorry, that is mislabeled there. But we'll now kind of dive into the fun section where how do we train these? How do we get them to change and develop? How do we get them better at their roles? Okay. So muscle adaptations to training. So we'll look first to type 1 or endurance-based training and seeing what we can do there. So we'll notice that there's an increase in delivery of oxygen to muscles. Why might that help? Well, if you think with type 1 or endurance-based training, we're trying to figure out how do we get oxygen from the blood to the mitochondria in order to produce more ATP, right, through oxidative metabolism. So how do we do that? Very simply, one of the ways is we can get more roadways or more capillaries surrounding and getting to the muscle fiber, in particular type 1 muscle fibers. So what happens is we get this process called angiogenesis, or generating of blood vessels in and around these muscle fiber types, okay? Another similar way that we adapt to try to get oxygen from blood or from the air or lungs into blood into the mitochondria is increasing the number of myoglobin cells or molecules in our muscle fibers. Now, again, just a little bit of a callback. If you recall, myoglobin is the shuttle system to get oxygen from blood to the mitochondria. So increasing the number of those is going to increase that capacity to deliver oxygen to our mitochondria. Okay. Another way that our aerobic metabolism can increase is we actually get more mitochondria and larger mitochondria, right? So we can house more complexes of, say, ETC enzymes. We can house a greater amount of protons and the different enzymes, anaerobic enzymes for Krebs, right? Okay, so we can increase our overall capacity for ATP. We do that through endurance training. So just to give you an example of what endurance training is, it's anything that's long duration, low intensity, again, typically longer than 20 minutes at a minimum, okay? Yeah, so here we are. We're going to look at now our resistance training. So we can switch gears and think of type 2 muscle fibers here. So the main way that resistance training will cause adaptations in the muscle fibers is primarily through hypertrophy and hyperplasia. The for sure number one thing is hypertrophy, and that's an increase in the size of muscle fibers. So we'll find with, that essentially when we create a stimuli on a working muscle, it'll break it down and then we need to build that back up, or the body repairs itself to improve to be able to handle the amount of stress that we had put it on before. So for example, you lift some really heavy weights in a squat, you actually do some damage to the muscles. The body will repair itself given time to repair, and then when it's at that kind of hypertrained level where it's ready for that same stressor, that same amount of weight with the squats you did, it's in that repair added new protein and new myofibrils essentially to increase the muscle size. Okay, and again, myofibrils are strands of sarcomeres all put together, so we increase that. So you can figure, if you go back to that image of what the muscle transections look like, it's like if you put more and more of those straws back into that tube or into the casing of a muscle, right? It's going to make it larger in size. Okay, the other thing that happens, or before that happens, I guess, you need more muscle, so myonuclei, so more nuclei on the muscle to help develop that increase in muscle fiber size. It needs that support, that greater amount of cellular support. Okay, now hyperplasia, I'll speak to that. That's a increase, so hyper is greater or growing or more. Plasia is multiplying, so that's number. So trophy speaks to size, plasia speaks to number. And there is some evidence, but this is a little bit more controversial as to which muscles do this and at what time, as far as increasing number of muscle fibers. So jury's out on this one, but it is potentially something happens. Usually hyperplasia happens in more of like a developmental sort of situation. So for example, when we're in utero or in the womb as fetuses, will tend to undergo hyperplasia, so we increase the number of cells we have before we grow in size, which would be more, or have our cells grow in size, which would be more hypertrophy. Okay, so resistance training, hypertrophy for sure. All right. So that's if we do, so those were points, again, if we did endurance training by itself and then resistance training by itself. But what if we did both at the same time? This is always an argument or a question that I get asked, or a bit of a debate. It feels like in the health and fitness world. But ultimately what we'll see with concurrent endurance and resistance training, so both happening at the same time, is strength will be compromised due to endurance training. So again, just that general fatigue that will be present in the muscles will tend to decrease the amount of strength. Similarly, the power. So again, the work over time, how much force or work can we do at a certain rate over time tends to be compromised because of strength. And you can think of that if you happen to have gone and done a strength workout. So again, let's say some push-ups or better yet, some squats, and your legs are tired. Just moving around, you might notice that you move a bit slower. And so at that rate at which you can produce force becomes compromised by strength training. Okay. Anaerobic performance can be decreased due to endurance training. So that's similar to saying strength training can kind of compromise our endurance training. And what we find there is there's a shift of our two types of anaerobic systems that shift more to the intermediate. So for example, our 2X, the really, really anaerobic muscle fiber types will start shifting to be more 2A. So again, that's our fast oxidative glycolytic muscle fiber type. Why? Well, our aerobic system, our endurance training, is trying to get more assistance from muscle fibers that can help support its oxidative metabolism. And then last but not least, just kind of recap that development of maximum oxygen consumption is not compromised when we do a concurrent training program. So our VO2 max is not compromised. And along maybe similar notes, our endurance capabilities are not diminished by strength training. So to kind of say that in a bit of a different way, this last part, our total endurance capacity or aerobic capacity doesn't change. And the fact that our endurance performance won't necessarily be diminished by strength training. That being said, if you need time to recover from strength training, of course you're going to need to, you're not going to be able to produce maybe as great of high intensity endurance training, but because you don't need a lot of force and it's just a longer duration, you usually can continue training at lower capacities and still train your endurance or aerobic systems without having that prior strength training diminish it. And truly, in contemporary training programs, endurance athletes definitely need to continue. It's recommended anywhere from 30 to 90 minutes of strength training a week in their training programs to help maintain or cross-train and to help prevent injury, but also help improve efficiency and performance. Because endurance training tends to wear down the body quite a bit because it's very repetitive, right? And long hours at low intensities. Yeah, so a way around doing concurrent endurance and resistance training, because from what we've learned about muscle fiber types as well as our metabolic systems, is it is good to try to incorporate a variety of training because one system does support the other. For example, having a good aerobic base will help you train more intensely, let's say, for a greater amount of time in your strength training sessions. So for example, you'll be able to replenish your ATP a little quicker if you have a greater aerobic base. And so as one example. So ideally, what are you going to be doing? You're going to periodize and prioritize your training. So what does that mean? Over the course of a year, you're going to have different parts of the year where you prioritize or periodize some of your aerobic training or your anaerobic training. And then you're going to prioritize either one of those systems based on the timing of year, like when you need to compete, when your main competition part of the year is, and plan your training that way. Okay, so that was it for muscle fiber types and the muscle adaptations that come with training and where you can look to improve your performance.